Bitcoin just filled with endless stories. Like the whole. I mean, Satoshi's like legend living on in the real world is a really cool thing because, like the fact that it's this far in, and he's gone, and people still debate his identity. And I think it's a marvelous thing. But the person who made it originally could have been like a scammer, or could have been, it could have been like a genius, but like deeply unethical or something. And it's really cool that the person who kind of put the pieces together acted the way that he did, or they did.
Okay, Lynn, Alden, thanks for taking the time to join us. Welcome back stateside.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So there are an insane amount of questions that I want to ask you about season 2 of Arcane. So you posted about Arcane, the Netflix series, like a couple months ago, and I was like, okay, like I'll go and check this thing out, and I just became obsessed. I knocked out season 1, I think, in like 48 hours, and then when season 2 came out, I was totally hooked. So I'm curious, like in hindsight, like tell me your hot takes on Arcane. Like, where do you think it ranks in kind of TV series, and what was your takeaways from the ending?
That's a good set of questions. I think it's one of the better animated things made in a very long time. I don't watch. I grew up watching a ton of animated stuff, and I obviously I watch a lot less now. And I missed the initial hype when that series initially came out. I just kind of missed it. I wasn't really watching it. And I think it was the initial trailers for season 2 that kind of told me this series even exists. Or even I think I heard about it and heard it's a League of Legends thing, and I'm like, like I'm not going to watch it. So it actually put it on my radar. I thought the first season was like 10 out of 10, or like 9.5 out of 10, like basically a masterpiece. Some of the most interesting villains in particular. Villains that kind of make sense is like they're bad, but they're the hero of their own story. You can see where they got to, where they got to. Season 2, I think it's still good, but I think that they try to do like 2 seasons in 1 season, and they try to expand the scope so much that I think that one was more mixed. I think the high points were still basically as high. So I won't spoil anything, but there's one episode where things have been going really fast for a while, and then they really slow down in this one episode in particular, and like the feels are just so like impactful. But I think that the narrative is a little bit more confused in season 2, a little bit more cluttered, and so I would put that much lower than a 10 out of 10, but it's still an exceptional production, I think. What are your thoughts on kind of the end result?
I have similar sentiment. There were, I think, maybe the third to last episode, whichever episode, like just, yeah, I felt it too. And I was like, oh man, like that kind of like hit hard. And I know that you kind of alluded to like these good kind of deep characters, maybe like you're alluding to like Silco. But I was a fan, just for the Vander storyline, even from just like early on in season 1, something about like that character and that development, and then seeing, without giving spoilers away, like how that developed and was brought back in this season 2, I just really loved. And in general, I think some of these series are great when you kind of can relate them to things happening in real life, and so there are a lot of relatable themes, things like power struggle and relationships and oppression and radicalization, and those, like as I was watching it, I was like, oh, this just reminds me of even like geopolitical events, or Bitcoin and energy. Like, I'm curious, did you feel that same way? Like, were you watching that? And I don't know, I'm so steeped into Bitcoin where I see something and I'm like, oh, is the Arcane kind of like Bitcoin? Did you feel any of that, or is that just like disconnected from how you think about reality?
I did, and I think they handled it well because they didn't let that get in the way of entertainment and character-driven stories. So sometimes you'll see a story that's like focusing on a topic, let's say oppression, and it can get very kind of preachy or less fun than it could be. And so they actually had a really good balance of, there was serious subject matter they wanted to talk about clearly. You had this kind of like over city and this under city, and these kind of problematic power dynamics, no representation of the lower city, struggles for independence, that kind of theme. And then you have, but it's not like it's pure. It's not like the good city is like pure evil. It's not like they're going out of their way. They're making like the other cities bad as possible. It's like you have these like people that aren't even aware in many cases of the power dynamics at play, which I think a pretty realistic depiction of how things work. Um, and then you had multiple characters on both sides kind of struggling in that environment. And so I think that they told a really interesting story, while also they have the whole character. It's like very character specific at the same time. And obviously, like parenthood was a really big theme throughout the whole show. So people lose their parents, they get adopted parents. Older siblings take care of younger siblings like parents. Um, and that's like a theme that keeps coming up in both seasons, especially season one. And as you mentioned, I mean, Silco, I thought was an incredible character. Low key, like breakout. Like you see him at first, and you think he's like a standard character, and then you kind of get to know him, and you're like, I mean, he's awful, but like he's always got a screen presence. I like it when plots don't rest on miscommunication. So these are two sides that have very different goals, and sometimes they even try to negotiate and make things work. And there's just basically there's rationality on both sides, and I just find that really compelling. And there are obviously a lot of parallels to our world, and I think actually that's one of the challenges of season two is they lost some of that more personal city versus city dynamic, and they got into a little bit more of a cosmic scope, which kind of is some people. I think one of the criticisms was we kind of cheated the initial narrative. We had this like thing going on, we kind of dropped that, and we got so big, we kind of left the more maybe real world challenges.
Yeah, well, okay, so a couple more comments on this, and then we'll get to Bitcoin. So if anybody doesn't care about Arcane, too bad. um, I was laughing because several years ago, I actually went down to El Salvador, and I met, I happened to grab dinner with like Max Kaiser and a few other people, and he was just like, yeah, Satoshi was sent back in time, and kind of like gave Bitcoin, to the whole rest of the world and disappeared. And spoiler alert, but when I was watching, Victor and him kind of going back in time, and he's the mage, and he's like, the arcane. I was like, oh man, like that, it just reminded me of this conversation with Max, and that maybe Bitcoin was given to us by some future time traveler.
Yeah, it's like a cool like concept to think about. And I definitely think like fiction allows us to explore so many cool things that are when you try to explore them in real life, people get mired in their own biases or their own kind of real life politics or their own whatever the case may be, and it's usually darker. Whereas exploring things in fiction lets you get more into things you wouldn't otherwise get to if you did it in a purely nonfiction environment. And so I mean Bitcoin just filled with endless stories like the whole, I mean, Satoshi's like legend living on in the real world is a really cool thing because he, like the fact that it's this far in and he's gone and people still debate his identity. And I think it's a marvelous thing. And then the way he released it was fascinating. And so you could imagine a scenario. Like I often point out that Bitcoin is like an inevitability in the sense that all the pieces were falling into place as technology came together. So that something like Bitcoin was eventually going to happen. But the person who made it originally could have been like a scammer or could have been, it could have been like a genius, but like deeply unethical or something. And it's really cool that the person who kind of put the pieces together acted the way that he did or they did.
There's no doubt. I mean, the immaculate conception, the kind of like magic of the story, the mystery, like however many years later, like it is compelling, and I think it will continue to be compelling in the future. But so I actually heard a rumor. I don't know if this is like an alpha leak that you may be writing a sci-fi novel.
I did. I wrote a first draft of a sci-fi novel. And I've been like sharing a little bit on Noster, like kind of talking about it. It's kind of like the scratching an itch I've had for a while. Like I mentioned before, I've always liked animation. I always like storytelling. I get pulled into really kind of good stories. And there's like a story bouncing around in my head for a while. So I decided to kind of like vent and just kind of get it out. Just kind of, because like this whole, during the whole COVID period, the whole like macro, everything in macro went crazy. It's like nonstop finance work, and it's like let's just work on something that's completely unrelated to investing, and just is just fun.
I love that. And so, have you gotten a good reception? Do you feel like you're going to progress it, maybe to something that you publish, or is this more like, hey, I just want to get it out there. This is different. Where's your kind of future thinking thought
So
process on this.
first I had my husband read it, and he liked it, and he's actually a pretty brutal critic. So got it past him, and then made some changes based on his feedback. I did have a professional editor go through it because fiction writing is not my strong suit. That's obviously it's a new thing for me to be exploring, and the nuances of prose and things like that are not my strong point. I write like an engineer, not like a poet. So you have to kind of change that a little bit for fiction. And I'm gonna send it out to some early readers to get thoughts. Basically, I don't know for sure that I'll publish it, but I do. It is like a semi-serious project. Like I put effort into it. I like the story, and I want to see if I can get it to something that I feel confident enough to publish.
I love that. Well, I'm looking forward to hopefully it kind of being published and sharing it with the rest of us. That brings up another question where, like, do you feel burnout? I feel like for you over the past few years, there's been this, I don't know, dare I say, like meteoric rise on Twitter, and you really become an authority in macro and Bitcoin. And I mean, you've been on like countless podcasts, and I imagine you said the same things over and over. Like, do you still feel that same, I don't know, kind of like passionate obsession for those topics, or have you kind of, like you said, started broadening into things like sci-fi and the Arcane conversation? I know you're into UFC. Like, where's your kind of head at now that you're so many years into really kind of saying a lot of the same stuff over and over?
I would say I went through a burnout phase last year. And that's probably because, so in 2022 and 2023, I was running my full-time business and all my other things while writing Broken Money. So writing a 500-page book while doing everything else. And so that was certainly like a huge, like going all out for a while. So after that was released and then some initial stuff after that, I kind of went through a period of burnout where it's kind of like I could use just kind of headspace. Traveling helps. And I tend to, I work consistently, but I also have these bursts where I get really into something for a while and then I kind of get burnt out and then I kind of phone it in for a little bit and just kind of use extra time to actually do other things and make sure my health is in order and make sure I'm exploring other more creative things. And then I get back to it. So I certainly think that this year I'm getting re-energized again because macro was kind of on autopilot throughout 2024 as well. So I was kind of burnt out and there was less to comment on maybe than there were in some prior years. And now we're getting a big shakeup, obviously. So I'm certainly re-engaged now, but it is true that I went through probably a period of burnout. And that's where something like a sci-fi book kind of pops out of nowhere or, things like that.
Yeah, totally relatable. I think a lot of people felt it from different angles, but I think we're excited to have you reengage. That brings up some of the other stuff around macro. Like now everybody knows you for like nothing stops this train. And like, is there anything more to add to that, or can that be the synopsis of kind of the current state of macro right now?
That's the current state of macro. I think the newest thing about that is it's the first biggest test of that thesis, right? So nothing stopped the train for the past couple of years. Now with things like Doge and the new administration, they're certainly optically going after the budget deficit. So when I talk about nothing stops this train, for people that don't know, it refers to how structural the U.S. deficits are. And then that has implications for asset prices. That has implications for inflation. That has all sorts of downstream effects. But it starts with the idea that we're in kind of fiscal dominance, running hot. And so I guess the newest thing there is to watch and say, okay, well, Doge has a target endpoint, which is mid 2026. So for the 250th anniversary of the country, they hope to get their biggest pieces done by then and to show a lot of results. And so we have basically an 18-month period where we can say, okay, well, what are the numbers? What was the deficit over that period compared to, say, the prior period? And my expectation is there going to be a lot of optical cuts. So a lot of like small things cut, and small can mean like billion here, billion there. But, the question is, can they really make a dent in what is almost a structural $2 trillion deficit? And it's like 10%, even 200 billion is not really much of a dent when it comes to money moving around of this size. So I think that's probably the latest thing about that is I think that's still the case. That's been a big investing pillar to get right because there are a lot of bears in 2022. And things were bearish in 2022 for a lot of assets. But what made me pivot to more bullish on things in 2023 and beyond was this fiscal dominance thesis. So it's not just, it's a meme, but it's also been helpful to be on the right side of things. And so I constantly observe it to make sure that it's still the case, to make sure I'm still kind of as much as I can be well positioned. So I think it's still going, and then it's now just being a little bit more tested.
Mm. And so have you been entertained by seeing what some of this money is being spent on, with the USAID or some of this stuff, or is that just kind of what you expected, where it's like, I don't know, we spent, it was like sent 5 million condoms to like Gaza, or like, there's just all these random things. It's like, why did we do that?
Yeah, it is. I mean, there is, of course, an entertaining element to it. I think one of the biggest things that Doge does is actually kind of shine a light on it, gets people talking about it more. And that's it's almost like I have two separate buckets. Because one, the thing that I point out, and I did a report with Sam Callahan where we kind of looked at this as well. The really big buckets are the ones that are really hard to go after: Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, defense in general, veterans benefits. Those make up the vast majority. They actually have, except for defense, most of that is low employees but really high transfer payments. Whereas the smaller part of government is like tons of employees, tons of small programs, tons of things that just kind of run, like the FAA. Except, recently obviously they've issues, but like it's all that kind of stuff. And that's where a lot of these cuts are happening right now. All these different little programs you do abroad, all these little things, the things that when you hear what they are, they're not very controversial to cut for many people. I mean, obviously there's a lot of people annoyed at them, but the general public is mostly just entertained by those cuts, which is different than if they try to cut something like Social Security or people's health care. And that's why those are historically third rails in politics. And what's interesting is that, I mean, during the whole 2010s environment, kind of the Paul Ryan Republican era was cut all the, make all the entitlement systems more sustainable, trim them, increase retirement age. So everything was kind of on the table. In the 2024 Republican platform is officially that they won't cut Social Security or Medicare or raise the retirement age. The core of the Republican Party, at least fiscally, has shifted to some extent when he went from kind of the Paul Ryan era to the Trump era. And so all the entertainment factor right now is on those like little things. And it's not to say that they're not relevant, and they have all sorts of implications geopolitically and all that. But the real test is, can they actually make a dent in all the defense spending? That's the biggest bucket of discretionary spending. And then can they find meaningful waste in Medicare and things like that?
Interesting. Okay. So your impression is that the optics are good, but jury is still out as to whether they can kind of start cutting into things that could be more material.
Yeah.
And so what about, like, you briefly mentioned like the tariffs? Like, what is your perspective on the tariffs? Will those be effective? Are they going to, stay for a long time? Any hot takes on tariffs?
So it was interesting to see that the initial tariffs were on close allied trading partners. That was kind of interesting. And then, but those got quickly delayed or put off the table for a while, focusing more on China. One of the things I keep pointing out is that the problem is it's more structural than many people make it out to be, which is we have the world reserve currency. That means all countries around the world, all sorts of entities use the dollar ledger as the thing they use for contracts, in many cases, international payments, the things that they finance each other in. So if a French investor finances a Brazilian company, it's often in dollars, even though dollars is neither their currency, it's the global reserve currency. Basically the biggest, most liquid, most saleable global currency. And in order for that to stay in place, they kind of always need more dollars. And the way that the U.S. supplies all those dollars indirectly, we don't choose to, but this is the way it works out, is we run these structural trade deficits. And the mechanism is that because everybody wants dollars, it bids up the value of the dollar more than the trade-weighted basis would normally say, which makes our import power really strong, and it makes our low-margin export competitiveness pretty weak, which mainly hits manufacturing. And so we kind of, the system kind of structurally creates a trade deficit and then fuels itself with the trade deficit. And the administration wants all the benefits of the global reserve currency, but then they don't really want the trade deficit, which is what's unsustainably fueling it. And I've been kind of beating the drum on this a while, that as it's gotten so imbalanced, the downsides of the system, mainly the trade deficits and the industrial hollowing out, have outweighed the upsides of maintaining that current system as is for more people than not. And so it makes perfect sense that that's now the political topic. But just like budget deficit cuts, I think trade deficit cuts, it's like turning a really heavy ship. It's a very long process, in my view, to reshore stuff, to change the way global trade works in such a way that this balance is at least partially curtailed.
And so basically what you're describing here is kind of Triffin's dilemma, right? This structural deficit over the past 50 years, and then now it's kind of an attempt to reverse that. Okay. And so do you think that it is the right call though to try to reverse that, or it's like the pain train is going to be so brutal that we actually reverse that, it's not worth it?
I think it's worth. I do think it's worth tackling it, and I think it's better to do it from a position of strength than to have it happen to you like when you're not even intending for it to happen. Because a lot of times a trade deficit, like a country will have a trade deficit, and the way it resolves eventually is they'll have like a major currency devaluation and recession, and their import power gets really hurt, and then the trade deficit kind of forces itself closed. That's kind of like the involuntary trade deficit reduction. If you kind of see it happening, you're realizing it's becoming a political issue. The political leaders are getting elected because so many people are viewing it as a political issue. It makes sense to try to tackle it from a position of strength. Then the question is the recipe right? So there are people in Trump's orbit like Stephen Moran and others that seem to have a pretty firm grasp of the problem. I think the challenge is like a lot of politicians will always kind of downplay the risks and overplay the upsides. So it's kind of like any politician will say you're going to have your cake and eat it too. And I think right now we're in kind of the honeymoon phase where they're kind of downplaying some of the challenges, risks, frictions, and timelines of trying to curtail that trade deficit. But I think it makes perfect sense to be tackling it. I think maybe more honesty around some of the trade-offs or why it's in place would be good.
I see. Okay, so last question on kind of like macro related stuff, then we'll go into Bitcoin. I'm curious, like I know that we have trillions of dollars of kind of debt that's maturing. And so we're going to have to go through this process of refinancing it. And do you have any sense as to how they're going to go about refinancing it and what the implications are? Like what type of bills maybe they're going to issue? And yeah, like how is that going to sort out? I think the number is large, like maybe close to 10 trillion, right?
Yeah, so I think for the next few months, it's not going to be a big deal. I think later this year, it gets more interesting. So for people listening, so the Fed was doing QE, then they switched to quantitative tightening. And so throughout 2022, there's a lot of tightening. And by the end of the year, and especially in 2023, the Treasury started to offset some of that quantitative tightening by issuing more T-bills to finance a higher portion of its debt than is historically normal. And they often do that during like recessions or during like the big COVID stimulus and things like that. But in 2022, 2023, they didn't really have a good reason. There was no emergency. There was no recession officially. There's no like, they just, for liquidity reasons, started issuing more T-bills. And the new Treasury Secretary was critical of that approach and basically the shortening of U.S. debt duration. Now that he's in place, he said that while the debt ceiling is still being sorted out, he's going to maintain current policy, basically. So a lot of that existing debt rolls over into basically the same instruments it's already in. T-bills roll into T-bills. Some of the older stuff rotates into kind of the same sort of like duration. There's still money left in the reverse repo facility, which provides liquidity, especially for the T-bill issuance. And ironically, when there's a debt ceiling issue, it's actually pretty good for liquidity while it's happening because the Treasury is forced to basically empty its cash reserves. It's kind of like if you're running a household and all your financing and income got shut off, but you still have bills to pay, one of your last resorts is to pay down from your existing bank accounts. And so that's what the Treasury does when they start to run into the actual debt ceiling. And so over the course of months, depending on how long that dispute goes, they spend more into the economy without being able to issue debt, which during that process is actually, it's usually pretty good for liquidity. They're draining their money out of a void into the banking system. It becomes tricky when they want to refill that. And I'm skeptical that the debt ceiling is going to last that long because, or like the debt ceiling dispute's going to last that long because this is the first time it's kind of intra-party. So normally Republicans use it against Democrat presidents. This is, Republicans control Congress and the presidency. So I think this is likely to be less protracted than the prior two debt ceiling disputes. But until it's resolved, the Treasury Secretary is basically on autopilot, and liquidity is probably okay. It gets really interesting in the second half of the year because the reverse repo facility will probably be done, and presumably Bessent's going to try to issue more coupons and fewer T-bills, which is not good for liquidity, but brings the duration back into the normal framework. And that's where there's some pretty significant risk for asset prices if they do try to dry up liquidity like that. And that's where you could see Trump and Powell being in some degree of conflict, because you could have to switch back to the Fed ending quantitative tightening, the Fed even potentially increasing its balance sheet a little bit to accommodate some frictions in the Treasury market. And that could be a little bit of a battle. So that'll be kind of interesting things to cover. But I think the next few months, probably not a ton of drama on that front.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I could keep the macro conversation going for a while. But let's switch this over to Bitcoin. So one of the things I had mentioned to you on Twitter that you kind of replied to is I felt that Bitcoin is at risk of kind of there's a faction that maybe has sold their soul for number go up. And I'm curious what your response, if anything, to that could be.
I think I'll start by saying what are the actions they take to sell their soul for number go up. I think it's maybe correct to say some people are almost all focused on number go up rather than say freedom money as a narrative. But what actions are they taking to prevent that from happening? Is that be kind of my main pushback or main question for that topic?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think that there's some deep state equivalent of like Bitcoin conspiracy theory, that's some evil entity for Bitcoin. But I do worry that number go up is such a powerful motive, and at this price in this market cap, what makes number go up is big entities, big financial institutions, and nation states, and I think that could be in conflict with this kind of like soul of Bitcoin, where maybe it's more about non-custodial use cases or scaling Bitcoin with potential changes to the protocol that may, could undermine its security because you're changing it or adding things, like privacy. I think that to me is a little bit scary. And that's actually what caused me, when I asked you that question about burnout a little bit earlier, I'm like, oh man, have we kind of lost the plot here?
Yeah, I would separate the burnout I went through was pretty different than what I think of overall Bitcoin. I think for me, it was just kind of running at full speed for a number of years in a rather crazy environment and then trying to kind of right size some of that. For Bitcoin in general, I think there's a couple verticals there. One is from the beginning, there's been a divergent economic view on basically store of value versus medium of exchange. And the store of value argument is basically saying that until people have a large cash balance in something, they usually don't even want to accept that thing. And so the argument is that except for in cases where someone specifically needs it, that store of value is going to appeal to more people earlier on than medium of exchange. Or another way to say that is more people have a store of value problem than a medium of exchange problem, especially in the developed world, which is where the majority of capital is. And that's not to say that there's not a lot of people with a medium of exchange problem. I mean, one of the first use cases for Bitcoin was, to donate to entities when they get cut off from PayPal and others. And so that's been in place from the beginning. But I think that basically medium of exchange, and we see this across blockchains, even other blockchains where there's maybe more activity, it's still often not a lot of medium of exchange. It's more like trading and things like that and speculation. And so I think that medium of exchange activity comes generally later when, one, people have more cash balances in it, and two, the volatility is less. And that generally happens through adoption. And And so that's kind of the one thing is like, so obviously the one part was trying to emphasize minimum exchange earlier, and the other part was basically fine with store of value generally coming first. Um, and I think the other challenge is that generally speaking, there's not sustained fees on Bitcoin. So there's been spikes of high fees. And then especially in the current environment where there'd be kind of new things developed and they would use the blockchain for other purposes. They'd have this brief period of super high fees, and then they go back to not having fees. So when the question is, how can we scale this more? I think it tends to fall on deaf ears when people will say, well, I'm looking at the blockchain and I don't see a scaling problem because I can send Bitcoin for almost free. Now, if you were to get enough people where even just store value becomes hard because the number of people that want to pull from an exchange and hold it, if that alone starts creating a sustained fee environment, like if 10x more people are using Bitcoin than using it now for either minimum exchange or just because they want to hold some, that I think creates more incentives to update some of the protocol for scaling. And this generally one of the things we see in macro is there'll be a certain trend that things are on, and a lot of people will assume this trend is like inevitable and it's just going to keep happening like this. But then what happens is when that gets like too problematic for too many entities, that's when there's usually a very sudden change. So for example, before 2020, a lot of people were saying inflation is dead forever. There's no way to generate inflation. And it's like, well, if you print a ton of money and literally send it to people, you're going to make inflation. And so I think that I'm not that worried about Bitcoin because I think that it's not even really gone through the phase where it starts convincing more and more people that changes have to be made. And then the other phase I look at is that, for example, the leading discussions around different types of covenants or different types of script changes. And there's not even agreement among developers per se on which one to do and in what order before it even gets to less technical people in general. So I think it's natural that people are kind of concerned about that, and I think it's fully understandable. And I even think other blockchains throughout kind of the history of Bitcoin, they've allowed the market to have a couple different shots to see, okay, what does the market actually want? Do they want something that's like got super high throughput, but then you can't really audit it yourself? Do you want something that's very expressive but maybe less decentralized? And I think right now the two biggest killer use cases of blockchain technology has been Bitcoin and stablecoins. There's other areas as well, but I think those are the two biggest, and those are the two that are probably the most freedom money related in the sense they're actually solving people's problems outside of speculation. And so yeah, I mean I'm happy to talk about other aspects of that, but
Okay, yeah, you mentioned so many things that I want to touch on here. Like the visual that I essentially have is very similar to kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's like the very bottom base layer is humans need their basic physiological needs. In Bitcoin, that's like making sure we don't increase the block size because it becomes more difficult and centralizes the network. We maintain the censorship resistance, and then you start building the network around Bitcoin. You start making the money, and eventually you kind of reach this like top part of the pyramid, which in Maslow's hierarchy, it's like self-actualization. It's this like pursuit of your higher purpose, like the sense of creativity. And I think what you're kind of saying is like maybe we're still traversing up that pyramid where there's not a need yet to have this like Bitcoin actualization, this monetary actualization of like medium of exchange or more expressivity because the level of adoption hasn't quite yet hit. I guess one question I have here is at what level of adoption would you kind of see, like, do you have some sort of metric where you say, oh, once X percentage of the world is on Bitcoin, then maybe it makes sense to start looking at some of these, different changes to Bitcoin to increase the scalability. And if there's not a level of adoption that we need to hit, and maybe instead your position is what you alluded to, where, well, there's no congestion on the chain, therefore we don't need to make any changes. Do you think there's any merit to me saying, well, that's because if we have no form of expressivity, no form of programmability of Bitcoin, then there's really no need to actually use the Bitcoin layer one. So it's kind of like, it's a reductive argument to say, hey, it's only one sat per VBuy right now, so why would we scale? When it's like, well, that's because you literally can't do any sort of programmability on Bitcoin. But if you could, then we would see sats per VBuy, at the 500 plus range. So do either of those two questions kind of resonate?
Yeah, I think the first part I would say it's always good to be exploring future things. You don't want to like start developing scaling solutions after you have congestion. It's just like I think congestion is what increases the urgency of users to push for those changes. I think there's multiple things, just like scaling should be explored, privacy should be explored, even quantum resilience should be explored, so that all these things are really well studied, so that when it comes time to various potential activations, these are not like new concepts. These are things that are very fleshed out over long periods of time, sometimes tested on other blockchains, sometimes just around in BIP form and reviewed multiple times and discussed. So I certainly am glad that people are looking at all those things. And even I can fully see why people are in favor of activation now for some of those things, especially some of the maybe the less controversial ones, where people see that there's fewer arguments of harm. And I think that the total addressable market for Bitcoin, even just as money, is so big. Like Fedwire is the biggest settlement system in the Western world. I don't have the current Chinese numbers for what their settlement system's like, but the Fedwire literally settles $2 quadrillion a year in volume, and it does it with about the same number of transactions as Bitcoin. It's kind of like oddly close on that front. And of course, the way it does is that every transaction is like massive. So it does like say rough numbers, 200 million transactions a year, average 5 million transaction size. Now, of course, Fedwire is a permissioned, closed, centralized system. And so basically, Bitcoin is this decentralized, permissionless, essentially version of Fedwire. And it would be problematic if it gets eventually so congested that only, 6-figure or 7-figure equivalent transactions make sense. That basically prices out a lot of people. And so you want ways to either build on top of it, sometimes custodially, sometimes non-custodially. There's multiple kind of trade-offs for all those. Maybe we could discuss. And so I think it makes sense. I mean, there are even people like Jameson Lopp that talk about how, even the block size shouldn't be completely off limits in a discussion. And I think that nothing's really off limits. People might argue that the increase in the block size wasn't fundamentally the issue. It was trying to increase it by that much, that early, and not having consensus. And the immutability and the auditability was really important. But maybe when 15 years from now, when processors are better and storage is better and bandwidth is better, maybe a slight block size increase would make sense. So, there's multiple things from covenants to block size to, they might even have to do that kind of thing if there's ever a need for quantum resilience. It might just take more block space to make, signatures that are resilient, that kind of thing. That's not really my area of expertise. So I certainly think that all things should be on the table for discussion. And then it comes down to what is the reason they're not activated now? Is anyone actively holding it back? And are enough people focused on it? And I'm pretty happy with the state of the network, but I fully get why other people are experiencing more urgency in terms of wanting some of these changes faster.
Yeah, I think that's a very pragmatic approach. And sometimes I try to check myself and say, look, I'm very into the ZK rollup stuff, the programmability, adding these non-custodial services. And am I maybe jumping the gun of, wanting to see change in Bitcoin? So I think it's like a very, rational conversation and kind of way that you presented it. On that front, I think you kind of alluded to me one time that it's not necessarily resistance to activating some sort of change, maybe like covenants in Bitcoin. It's that really there's not even consensus within the covenants community as to which change is best. So maybe there would be a superior argument if we said definitively, there is technical consensus around this covenant change, but somewhere is kind of blocking us. And I think that opened my eyes a bit where I was like, I think Lynn is possibly right on that. Like the covenant space itself still feels too messy. So maybe you could elaborate on that. Like, do you feel that's accurate, or do you feel that there's technical consensus forming on a specific possible covenant change?
Yeah, so I've been observing this for the past couple years where when I'll speak to a developer, I'll hear one thing and it seems somewhat out of touch compared to other parts of the network. So back in like 2023, there were certain developers I was talking to that were like super confident there'd be a covenant change in the next 12 months. Um, and then 12 months later, it's like, well, now we're kind of talking about different covenants and we've not activated that. And it's kind of a new set of main characters for what those covenants might be. And then we explore some of the older covenant proposals. And I try to straddle between the technical and the non-technical because I'm not a computer scientist, but I historically was an engineer and engineering manager. I try to then explain some of the technical things to a non-technical audience the best that I can. I try to talk to more people that are more technical than myself to make sure I'm understanding things correctly. And yeah, that one of my arguments is that um, among the most technical people, there's still debate around how aggressive of a script change should be made, um, which ones have risks, which ones are insufficient on their own, which ones are the most efficient. There's always some politics involved in these kind of things, and there's not really this like clear like consensus enough that becomes clear even outside of the technical community. Like when Taproot was kind of settled on, there wasn't, from a lot of people in the non-technical space, they didn't really see any controversy or disagreement there, so no one really held anything up. Whereas in the Covenant space, there's like so much discussion, even though most of those changes are simpler than something like Taproot. Um, there's still a lot of inter-developer discussion and debate.
I think part of that problem is that there's no kind of technical high priest. I think historically, most people will point to, two major developers like Greg Maxwell and Peter Willey, and they kind of champion this. And so, some of these changes in Bitcoin, it was kind of, open and decentralized. But at the end of the day, like you have somebody who's extremely well respected that's kind of taking a little bit of a stance and saying, no, like this is the direction that we're going to go. Do you think that we've lost that a bit? And do you think that that's a problem, that there's nobody in the community that would step up and express an opinion? People go, oh, they have spoken. I'm pretty comfortable trusting that person.
I think it's a natural progression from an early network to a later network, because that's both a pro and a con. I mean, we've seen this in other blockchains too. I mean,
Yeah.
if there's a high priest and it just kind of happens, that's obviously really good for efficiency and getting things done. It's like having a benevolent dictator or like a philosopher king, right? It's like it works when it works. It doesn't work when it doesn't work. I think as Bitcoin gets bigger, with way more people involved, it's natural that some of the earlier people, I mean, they could get burnout. They could want to stop focusing on it. Obviously, there were periods of lawsuits where it became challenging to be a developer. And so I think it's natural and in some ways good that we don't have that anymore. But there's obviously downside to that. I think the healthiest thing would be that if a clear enough need forms, that there will be more of those people stepping up, either ones from the past stepping back up to say, I really support this change, or people that have in the years since built up enough clout that enough of the really big ones center around the same change and that there's enough of a incentive. That kind of goes back to my prior point that while fees are low outside of like, occasional bursts of mostly non-transaction activity or like non-payment activity, there's not like a compelling reason that like millions of people want more, out of a certain network. So I think the conditions have to favor that a little bit more, and I think we'll be more likely to get that. But I think that's basically the path that's gone down. There used to be people with a ton of clout, and now on average, those are less active, and there's less of a center of mass, I think, in terms of technical guidance.
Yeah, fair points. I think if we can come out on the other side and find ways to come into alignment and consensus without a high priest, then it just further reinforces, how amazing Bitcoin can be. I'm curious, you mentioned kind of like champions of the past or champions moving forward. And I don't know if you saw, like Jeremy Rubin came out, I think yesterday, he said it, later this month, like he is going to be throwing his support behind a Covenant proposal that includes like CTV and checkstick from Stack. Now, I don't know if he's going to like code up an activation client and push for activation, but he is kind of coming out and taking a little bit more of a stand. Do you have an opinion on that that kind of differs from anything that you said previously? Is that interesting to you all that Jeremy's taking such a position again?
So I think it's fair to try. I've seen some of his tweets. I don't have enough context to have a super in-depth opinion on it. And that's some of the things that we covered in BCAP, but in the project we did, and that was purely descriptive, not prescriptive. So that wasn't taking a stance on any covenant or for or against any specific change, but it did kind of explore some of the opportunities or risks of alternative like activation clients, and what happens if you get, say, minor adoption, but not much economic node adoption, and some of the risks that can build from those kind of like a certain path dependence that can happen. And again, the view of the paper was not that like alternative activation clients are bad, because the fact that that's an option is really important to not be like fully captured. But it does come with risks. So, and I do think that it's fully natural that as this goes on in a stalemate, that people can take more aggressive actions. And then it just comes down to whether they can gather the support. And I guess it's harder to do in a lower fee environment because the urgency seems less for many people. And some of the people we kind of focus on are the technical users. And I think another challenge with covenants is they're often depicted as like trustless solutions, where you can have non-custodially you can unilaterally get back to the main chain. But in a unilateral sense, that works for big entities, whereas small entities still are kind of at the mercy of fees in that environment. And so there's almost every one of these has technical trade-offs. But yeah, I'm certainly not really against the types of covenants that Jeremy's been, kind of cheerleading and developing.
Okay. And so let's progress this further, kind of some of the stuff that we're working on. I think in the past couple of years, like people have been reinvigorated, for better or worse, on Bitcoin development, this like whether you want to call it Bitcoin Renaissance or Bitcoin Season 2, and that we can hack in, some of this covenant-like behavior or scalability or expressivity using something like BitVM, and really now BitVM 2. And so I'm curious, like, are you monitoring this? Like, what's your opinion on it? Is there anything there that intrigues you, or are you kind of gently skeptical on it? And no hard feelings, whatever you say.
I am optimistic on it. Ever since BitVM, the paper came out, and then all of these later developments came out. I've always been excited to talk to some of the most technical people in the space to explore the idea with them. I think one thing it shows is that there's a lot of design space that's not fully explored. And that's an example of, kind of like necessity is the mother of invention. So when people have really tight constraints, that's also part of why I don't know if complacent is the right word, but I'm like pretty happy with the state of the network, is because I'm actually really optimistic on what developers can do given constraints and when there's clear need for something. Like anyone who has studied some of the coding of like old video games, like how they got like Mario on, the NES, or like Pokemon on those things, like the things that they had to do to like compress data and compress all sorts of other stuff in those really constrained environments were actually like really crazy. There's like really funny examples that they had to do. And I think we're kind of seeing a similar thing on Bitcoin. It's like trying to program on an old video game console. You have all sorts of constraints. And I'm pretty excited about some of these developments. The only, I guess the part where I'm more skeptical, and I always try to be skeptical on anything. So it's more like understanding that there's trade-offs and there's rarely like a free lunch, is that some of the solutions will give more unilateral control back to the base layer, but in exchange for more technical complexity and therefore potential hack risk. It's kind of like how going to DeFi for a second on other chains, people say, well, this is great because it's non-custodial, but it's like it's also hackable. So you're trading custodial risk for some degree of like technical risk. And compared to something like just like a federated sidechain, let's say Liquid, for example, um, you generally have a different set of trade-offs where on one hand you're able to make things that are non-custodial, but potentially the number of moving parts. And I know that some of the covenant proposals can simplify some of those designs to reduce the technical complexity. That's one of the incentives for doing that. Um, and then the other thing I tend to be somewhat critical of or skeptical of is to point out that, if you've got millions of people on some L2, it's not like the smallest entities can settle back to the main chain, because they could have their little, like, if you got $20 worth of Bitcoin on an L2 and fees in that environment are higher, and you try to settle back onto the chain in some way, you can run into, your entire money is eaten up by fees. Whereas, of course, that's relevant for a really big holder on that L2, that they can afford the fees to kind of get back on. And so I think that there's occasionally things that I'm skeptical of, or that I'm maybe like, that kind of pointing out that there are trade-offs, but I'm super bullish on ongoing development on Bitcoin, both with the existing set of things, and then potentially with other expressivity on the core code added in there.
Yeah, I think you mentioned so many points that I kind of hit the nail on the head. I actually wasn't familiar with kind of how much innovation had to occur to bring things like Mario into existence. So I'm actually going to go up and read on some of that. I think you also touched
An
on.
example is like when Mary's like jumping around in like the old NES, and you'll see like lines form on the screen, and it looks like it's just kind of like glitching out. But actually, they're there because like you're running into like constraints, and so they're purposely putting lines there to, like, because it's like the least bad way to disrupt your playing experience when that's happening, that kind of thing. But there's all sorts of examples like that.
Funny, yeah. I actually think that very much relates to kind of what we're doing with BitVM 2 right now, where you touch on it so perfectly, where it's like we can build some of this stuff without covenants, but it is a little bit hacky, and yeah, you can get the absolute best trust assumptions, and not be custodial, but yeah, like we think we have world-class engineers and researchers on there, but it is still a bridge. And so there is, functional risk there. And I also think the point that you brought up about federations, as much as we give them a hard time, like we could look back, 10, 20 years from now and say federations were, one of the single greatest innovations for Bitcoin. And I'm, as much as I'm on the side of kind of like pushing forward the frontier of innovation, I'm very sympathetic to that view. And I'm very grateful that we have things like federations and Fedimints and Liquid. Like these could be solutions that, we default to that are better than, maybe just like going to Coinbase or something like that. With that said, so let's assume we get past that and we open up this kind of like whole space of programmability and expressivity into Bitcoin. You previously said that really just like Bitcoin is store of value and stablecoins are really kind of the only things that have product market fit. Is there anything else that is intriguing on the expressivity and programmability side that you actually think could be useful for Bitcoin?
Well, I think that the fact, like, open timestamps, I think is interesting. So the fact that, I mean, technically Bitcoin is the most immutable database we have. And so I think there is a use case for non-monetary information. Now, obviously, the most like efficient way to do that is when you don't actually store the thing on chain, but you store the hash, you store like the verification. So, you're still, say, storing documents elsewhere, but then you're proving that those documents were not tampered since this block. I think that's got a bigger use case than people think. I have watched the kind of full gamut across kind of the altcoin space. So watching DeFi, watching NFTs. So I think the digital collectibles do have value to people, and like little communities that people build have value to people. I think that especially in environments where people don't have access to certain capital environments, on-chain trading can make sense. It's not clear you need to have that on Bitcoin, but certainly, generally you want the network effects and the robustness of Bitcoin is appealing to a lot of people. And it's the same thing kind of applies to stablecoins. It's like if stablecoins are centralized anyway, how much do you care that they're running on Bitcoin versus some other more centralized blockchain? The part where you'd care is if you happen to really want Bitcoin, but in the same wallet you want stablecoins. That's the main argument. And you don't want to run like two different blockchains kind of together. So there's certainly a use case for that. It's not that I don't think there's other things outside of Bitcoin and stablecoins, but basically the way I kind of think of it is that the global portable store of value problem is like $100 trillion problem looking to be solved, right? And the global cross-border payment and cash balance and all that, that's probably a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. Whereas most of the other things I view as, multi-billion-dollar opportunities or whatever the number they are. It's a big step down from basically money. But it's not to say that I don't think there's any there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think I can definitely align on that front with terms of like priority and the size of the market and like the importance to the world as a whole is the kind of the money, the store of value, and that kind of like low level Fed wire replacement. I want to you mentioned one thing that's kind of interesting, which is mainly using Bitcoin more as like a verification layer where we don't actually use it as a computation layer. We don't try to perform all this computation on Bitcoin, but instead we kind of perform these things off chain or we store data in other places. And then you simply are able to just post like some small compressed version of that on Bitcoin. And Bitcoin kind of becomes like, a bulletin board as this kind of like global settlement layer of truth. And I think that's where a lot of the scaling solutions are pushing forward is instead of Ethereum, kind of like L1 trying to add programmability and expressivity to the layer one, you're instead just turning Bitcoin into more of this bulletin board or this verification layer. And so I think that's a very powerful concept of where things are heading. I apologize. So that was me just kind of sharing some on that. I am curious though. There were a few other use cases on the programmability side that I think you mentioned, which I want to bring up. One is this idea of account abstraction. And so this is a way to kind of create like world-class user experience for people holding or spending their Bitcoin. So, you could take something like your phone here, which actually technically has like a hardware wallet inside of it, like a ledger or a Trezor. And then you could actually use that to securely store your private keys non-custodially and send payments. And I think that's something that people underestimate, because like we can do payments with Lightning Network, but you can't really add in that programmability to make the user experience like this perfectly beautiful, seamless thing. So even moving aside DeFi and NFTs and stuff like that, do you see value and kind of the ability to make the user and payment experience like far more efficient?
I do. Yeah. So any change that, especially conservative changes that make that more possible, I'm always happy to see that explored. Either developers work with the existing code to try to find ways to improve it, or proposing changes to the base layer that would enable something that's really powerful that is, the risks are pretty understood. I think one of the biggest questions we have around this whole space is what is the market size for kind of like self-sovereignty money-wise, which is, so some people say the fact that this network can't scale to 8 billion people is a problem. Like you can't have 8 billion people that have just complete self-control of their own money with low fees and have zero trust. I think we don't really live in a world of like 8 billion lone wolves. There's some percentage of people that have both the inclination and that are willing to expend some resources, because decentralization is expensive. Not trusting anybody is expensive. And one of the ways that multiple people can use Bitcoin in a way that there's somewhere in the middle is basically say, you can find people you want to trust together, which is to say, with, say, something like FedWire, the current status quo for banking, you don't really have a choice. You're in a country, there's a central ledger, then there's banks that have to comply with that central ledger. And there's not that many ways around it other than things like Bitcoin and stable coins and other things. What the technology allows people to do is to choose who they trust. And so that's where, for example, like people can build their own federation if they want. They can build their own little community bank. They can have like an Uncle Jim that runs a Chalmian Mint for his family and like the neighbors. And there's literally, they know him. If he rug pulls them, there's recourse that they have access to in many cases. And so I think that there's like this spectrum of trust, and there's a trade-off between trust, convenience, and then how cheap it is, and what trade-offs have to go into this. So I think that obviously on Bitcoin base layer and any sort of higher levels on it, you want to have as much like possibility for people as possible. So you want to make fully trustless as cheap and as possible for as many people that want it. So the question is, I don't know how many of the 8 billion people in the world want to trustlessly use Bitcoin, but if possible, I want any one of those who want to be able to. And then the next best thing is, well, okay, if we can't get every single person who wants to for basically free, then it's like, well, how can we allow them to group together and cut the cost down by an order of magnitude or more? So I think that there's always going to be a room for trust in scaling mechanisms, or at least some scaling mechanisms. And that I think the thing I sometimes worry about is that the people that are like power users aren't necessarily great judges of how most people are going to want to use these networks. And I don't really fully know how many people want to be power users on Bitcoin. I think that's still actually a pretty open question. And that can change as Bitcoin's around more and people grow up with it. And things that are power users today might seem super intuitive, like in the future. Like there was a time where using your own computer was like a power user thing, and now it's just basic. So it could be in the future things change. So I think that these things take longer, and I think that one of my main points is that there is that kind of who to trust component rather than just do you have to trust.
Yeah, I think I'm very well aligned with everything that you said. That first and foremost, the market size for sovereignty is tenuous and uncertain. And I'm also sympathetic that 8 billion people are not going to want to be self-sovereign, but it is all about giving them the option, not necessarily the obligation or the requirement to actually be self-sovereign. For me, like I come into Bitcoin really from that monetary perspective, and the ideas of money as an information system is like a very powerful concept to me. But if people are kind of limited in the ways that they can express their views into the market with money, that they're limited in the sense that maybe they can't create programmability with it, or they're limited in the fact that they can't express themselves with privacy, or you're limited in some other facet, then indirectly that is actually distorting the price signals in the economy. And it kind of dilutes money's ability to kind of create this information system, which is like the backbone of, what leads to all this productivity with capitalism. And so that is something that constantly rings in my head. Like we talk about Bitcoin as, free speech, and it's like, it's free, but only for these very confined things that you can say, which is kind of the current Bitcoin base layer. But if we expand this level of expressivity, then you're increasing the breadth and the scope of ways that you can express yourself. And therefore the price signals are far more efficient. I'm curious if that lands with you.
I agree. The interesting thing about Bitcoin and the broader space is that we do get a lot of opportunities for the market to express itself. So like the block size war, for example, was an opportunity for the market to express itself. The rise of smart contract blockchains gave the market opportunity to express itself. We generally don't see a lot of longevity from a lot of these non-monetary use cases. They tend to have a burst of popularity, and then kind of the self-reinforcement fades, and then we move on to other things. And if Bitcoin was not meeting a certain need, and there was some other blockchain like really gathering for a sustained period of time, tons of users, tons of activity, and then without all the handicaps. So for example, the fact that Bitcoin is like 60% of the market, despite, like you point out, we don't really have high priests anymore in Bitcoin. There's no like big central marketing budget. It's just kind of, it is what it is. And there's been criticism of Bitcoin that, like, for example, I forget what year it was, but I mean, TVP put out papers on this showing like, over a given 2-year period, there'd be like 70 billion in VC capital for altcoins and like 1 billion for Bitcoin. Depends on what exactly you count, but it's like an order of magnitude difference. And yet, Bitcoin is still the vast majority of the market and liquidity, and things like that. I think if we saw, especially past like initial funding and all sorts of that, if there was like sustained usage elsewhere outside of Bitcoin, that is a market signal to pay attention to say, is this something that Bitcoin is not fulfilling that the market is finding elsewhere? So far, I think nothing has lasted long enough to really do that, except for essentially stablecoins have kind of been the sticky thing. But even then, we're talking a market that's smaller than Bitcoin. So I think that Bitcoin, like to your point, it can limit what can build on it because we might not even get the full answer for what the market wants if Bitcoin has certain rules. But I guess that is like, there are people that say that altcoins should never exist. And I'm not really in that camp because I think that it's inevitable that there be some experimentation. Now, I'm super critical on the vast majority of altcoins, the way that they're launched, the sketchy tokenomics and, founders and investors escaping with like fast exit liquidity without building something unlike traditional VC. A million problems there, but it is natural. I think that if we were to kind of see the birth of Bitcoin 100 different times and run this experiment, on 100 different Earths, I think every time it spawns, there will be other ones that come along too, because that is the market to some extent trying. I mean, sometimes it's scammers, but other times it's the market trying to say, what do we prioritize more? And then over time, the market, I think, tells us what it wants. And people, if they don't find it on Bitcoin, they build it elsewhere. And so far, there's usually, they burn bright and then they kind of dwindle. Whereas we can see if anything kind of builds elsewhere or if all the market today is mostly on Bitcoin.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me that many of these use cases don't really have validation aside from ephemeral, token incentives that are used to prop them up. And I think even the best of intention people, if they get, a couple $1 billion in a token, they're looking at themselves and saying, maybe I just want to go live on an island with my wife and create a family. And so I think tokens have led to like very heinous incentives for building out these use cases. Maybe one of the last things that I want to ask you about is, you mentioned a lot about obviously Bitcoin and then stablecoins. And so do you have a view on Bitcoin-backed stablecoins or censorship-resistant stablecoins? This is something that I've kind of shared with you before. Like, do you think there's any credibility in those? And do you think that they could ever compete on the level with centralized state?
I do think there's validity there. And I think, it's obviously, it's a difficult area to tread because there's been so much problems with algorithmic stablecoins. Now, that's different. Like, say something like Luna, and I wrote about Luna's problems before it blew up. And so basically backing an artificial dollar with like a new altcoin is like inherently unstable. It's basically running an emerging market central bank without any sort of jurisdiction. It's asking for trouble. There are other ways to do stability that don't fully rely on centralized dollar collateralized stablecoins. I think for a lot of people that are just using stablecoins as working capital and they've not experienced getting censored or rug pulled, and they're working in fairly small amounts, that serves a lot of people's needs. But I do think that, again, we can have the market explore to say what is the demand for stablecoins that are more decentralized, that don't have a single point of censorship or rug pulling. And we talked about before about there's some liquidity protocols that this is doable on. So I certainly think that's another area that does deserve more exploration overall.
Yeah, it's something that's become a deep passion for mine. I think one of the issues is the optics that you alluded to. Like when people think of these non-fiat backed stablecoins, they immediately think of something like Terra Luna, and that is an algorithmic stablecoin. But there are models of stablecoins like over collateralized or CDP style stablecoins that, in my opinion, are like totally functionally different than something like Terra Luna, which was kind of doomed to fail from the beginning, versus a CDP style model, has really kind of proven to function through like extreme drops in the underlying collateral, like, up to 80%, value. And some of these have been like quite well battle tested. And I'm generally optimistic that some of the kind of this newest generation of these are kind of actually living up to some of the hype. Fingers crossed. Knock on wood. You also kind of alluded to. Were you alluding to things like stable channels and stable sats when you were looking at this exploration?
Well, yeah, that's an option. Also, liquidity has historically, we discussed that one before. There are these kind of like pretty interesting explorations on ways to do things that are more competent than something like Terra Luna, and not built on using something like Luna as the collateral. Um, and I think that the main challenge there, from what I understand, is not necessarily that they can't work. It's that, one, are they economically efficient enough? Can they get into significant network effect territory? Because even in fiat collateralized stablecoins, there's pretty clear network effects. And then so introducing another model, it can be kind of a chicken and the egg problem. So it's mainly about efficiency. How decentralized are they? And then can they get big enough to start really mattering? But I think those are valid exploration paths.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, the collateral efficiency is actually pretty much solved. I'd say the decentralization is solved. Like, I know that's like a very bold claim. Technically, you can't get rid of the Oracle, but you can burn the upgradability of these contracts. They can govern themselves without a token, without human governance. They can be quite efficient. So like a lot of those hurdles have been passed, but it brings us back to the point where you mentioned, where it's like distribution. Like, why would anybody actually hold this thing, especially when you can earn the underlying yield on treasuries? And I would say that's the biggest hurdle to adoption. Is it seems almost like an insurmountable task to break that network effect that centralized stablecoins have. So for me, it's more of a noble pursuit that I think would be interesting for us to go after in Bitcoin, but an uphill battle nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's a similar thing with, like, say, custodial wallets for small amounts, right? So this is another thing that comes up, is like people will want every payment they do to be non-custodial. And it's kind of like how when people walk outside and they have their wallet and they have, maybe a couple $100 in it, they know there's a chance they could lose it or get mugged or something, but they're willing to take that risk with small amounts of capital. Um, and I think with both custodial Bitcoin wallets and with stable coins in general, there's a similar thing where when people are dealing with an amount of money that's like small for them, and that's obviously very different for people in different parts of the world and where you're coming from. But when people are not dealing with like real store value, they tend to be less critical of the thing that they're using. They're saying, well, if I get rug pulled from this custodian that's been operating for 5-10 years,
Sure.
and I have $300 in there, maybe it's not the end of the world. It's like I'm basically getting all that efficiency, and then over time we should see more stable ones than because historically crypto has been operating on the outskirts of kind of, it's always kind of pushed the margins. So as it comes more into the center, I think you can have things like reliable custodians, reliable, we've already had reliable stablecoin issuers, but we could have more choice there. And I think that, again, it's like a power user question. I think a lot of users of stablecoins and users of like small custodial lightning wallets and things like that, they generally think, I just want this to work. I want it to be super simple. Obviously, I want the entity to have a good reputation, and to not have like rugged me in the past. But it's like, I think that like a lot of people are fine with small amounts of capital in what power users would view as a rarely risky situation, versus store of value. So I think there's like an uphill battle in trying to make stable coins more robust, but it's not that I don't think it's valid to explore. I just think it's challenging.
Yeah, I can align there. I think one thing that I'll gently push back on is, even if we're fine with some of these custodial solutions, like maybe we're hinting at Lightning networks here, maybe we're hinting at Fedimints here. Like these do add elements of privacy, whether it's like hardcore perfect privacy, like Fedimints, or kind of like obscuring of the transaction graph, and like pretty good but not perfect privacy in Lightning. And I think those are a little bit at odds, because if you have a centralized stablecoin in one of those, like, they just won't survive. Like, they'll get censored, they'll get shut down. So do you see that as a risk?
I think potentially. I think it's if you have small, decentralized, private solutions, stablecoins can potentially interact with those. But I do think it makes sense for those types of entities to, like, if there's a group that is going to be particularly interested in like decentralized stablecoins or decentralized stable value of some sort, it is the more privacy focused types. Because if you're running non-private and you want to incorporate stablecoins in your wallet, many people are fine with the collateralized ones, the fiat collateralized ones. But yeah, I think privacy, and this is where I'm on the record that I think privacy is going to be a big battle for a long time. So even though, for example, the current U.S. administration is obviously more favorable to Bitcoin and crypto than the prior one, I think that privacy is going to be an ongoing issue in the U.S. and elsewhere for quite a while. And so it is important to have solutions built with that in mind. And I do think that some of those privacy solutions have more an incentive to have decentralized stablecoins.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think that answered all my questions. Is there anything else that maybe you have hot takes on it that you want to leave us with, or that you felt that we didn't, sufficiently cover?
I mean, I think it was a good discussion. I think that that's the kind of, I guess, is summarized because some parts were kind of rambling, I guess. It's like part of it is we want to have as many solutions as possible thought out, even coded, to even know what the possibility set is. And then the secondary question is, okay, what is the market size for sovereignty, monetary sovereignty? Can that market size be increased if we make it easier and cheaper to do? I think the answer is yes, but then the question is by how much? And then the third point is realizing that trust is not just a question of are you trusting someone or not trusting someone. Simply the power to choose who to trust is a really big deal. That is like a massive unlock compared to the old system, which is that you don't really get to choose who to trust at all. So even the choice of who to trust, and then in some case, if you have the resources or incentives to not trust anyone, or to minimize your trust as much as possible down to like the base layer, is a great solution too. So yeah, I think we agree a lot on what priorities are, what goals are, and I'm always in favor of exploration and kind of finding new things. And I'm very optimistic on things that developers can do and figure out. I think we're going to always be surprised at the upside in terms of how much creativity can be done to make relatively robust systems.
Definitely. I think that's a good summary of the positions. It, for me personally, gave me a lot of clarity and a few things to kind of mull over. So we'll call it there. Lynn, I really appreciate you coming on, and this was super fun.
Yep, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.